There is a moment that nobody photographed and nobody recorded, which means it survives only in Henry Hill's own account of his life. A boy of 13 carried a drink across the room at a card game in Brooklyn in the mid 1950s, walked it from the bar to a table, and set it down in front of a large, well dressed man who was winning. The man reached into his pocket without looking up from his cards and produced a $20 bill. He pressed it into the boy's hand, not as a test, not to make an impression, because that was simply the way this man moved through the world, throwing money at people as a form of expression, generosity as demonstration of position, a casual command over his own resources that announced something about him before he had said a word. The boy had never seen anything like it. The men he knew, the men in his neighborhood, did not do things like that. The man's name was James Burke. Everyone who mattered called him Jimmy. The boy's name was Henry Hill. The relationship that began with that $20 bill would last 24 years and run through every serious crime Henry Hill ever committed, through airport robberies and a murder that nobody was supposed to discuss, through a federal prison sentence, through the largest cash robbery in American history, through a killing campaign that eliminated most of the people who participated in it, and finally to the morning when Henry Hill sat in federal custody and listened to a surveillance recording of Jimmy Burke telling a colleague that Henry Hill needed to die. That morning, Henry Hill chose survival over loyalty. What that choice cost Jimmy Burke, what it cost the Lucchese crime family, and what it reveals about the world these two men built together is a story that begins in a Brooklyn neighborhood where reputations were earned block by block and ends in a federal courtroom where one man's memory put 50 people in prison. But first, there was the card game. And before the card game, there was the neighborhood. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. Whether you are in Brooklyn or somewhere 10,000 miles from it, it is genuinely one of the best parts of putting these stories together. If you are new here and want history like this delivered directly to you, subscribe now and you will not miss a single one. Back to East New York and back to the boy who walked across the street. Henry Hill was born on June 11th, 1943, the son of Henry Hill Sr., an Irish-American electrician, and Carmela Costa Hill, a Sicilian immigrant who had made the crossing from Italy and raised her children with the particular determination of someone building something in an adopted country. The family was large, 7 or 8 children, and they lived in the Brownsville section of East New York, a working-class corner of Brooklyn where, in the 1940s and early 50s, the landscape of daily life was organized around poverty, physical proximity, and the visible presence of men who had found a way to live above both. Henry Hill was dyslexic and performed poorly in school, which in that neighborhood and in that era meant that school was not going to hold him. What held his attention was directly across the street from his family's apartment, a dispatch cab stand run by Paul Vario, a capo regime in the Lucchese crime family, one of the 5 criminal organizations that divided New York City among themselves and operated with an authority that no legitimate institution was ever going to successfully challenge in the 1950s. Vario also ran a pizzeria and a shoeshine stand in the same vicinity, legitimate fronts that gave his operation the appearance of a neighborhood business. The men who came and went from those establishments were not there for the food or the shoeshines. They wore good clothes, they spoke in low voices. They were treated with a deference that the neighborhood extended automatically, without being asked. And they clearly did not worry about money. What they represented was not simply personal success. They represented a parallel economy, one that had existed in that corner of Brooklyn for decades before Henry Hill was born, and that would exist there long after he left. Local businesses paid for the right to operate without being robbed. Loan sharks provided capital that no bank would offer to people in that neighborhood. Gambling operations ran out of storefronts that also sold other things. The Lucchese family's presence was not just criminal. In the specific way that organized crime embeds itself in an economically marginalized neighborhood, it was structural. Vario was not simply a man who committed crimes. He was a kind of informal governing authority in that corner of Brooklyn, and everyone who lived there understood it. For a boy who was poor, who could not read well, and who watched this from his front window every day, the message was not subtle. The men across the street had found something. What they had found was a world that operated on rules he had not been taught in school, but that he recognized intuitively as the rules that actually governed the neighborhood he lived in. The school had its rules, and the street had its rules, and the street's rules were the ones that had consequences. In 1955, when Hill was 11 years old, he walked across the street and into the cab stand looking for a part time after school job. What he found was the beginning of a career. He started running errands for the men who gathered there, delivering messages, fetching things, making himself useful in the incremental way that establishes a young person's presence in an organization before anyone has decided what that presence is worth. Paul Vario noticed him. Vario's brothers noticed him. Vito Vario, who the neighborhood called Tuddy, began assigning Hill tasks that escalated over the following months from minor to significant. By the time Hill was in his early teens, he was facilitating the collection of loan payments and gambling debts from construction sites across the borough. In the year after Hill began at the cab stand, Tuddy Vario and Lenny Vario, Paul's older brother, presented Hill with a union card in the bricklayer's local. It was a no-show card. Hill would appear on a building contractor's payroll at $190 per week without ever approaching a construction site. He received a portion of that amount. The Varios kept the rest. The card also gave Hill access to the construction sites where payments were collected on behalf of the crew. A fiction of employment wrapped around a criminal function, which was precisely how such arrangements were designed to work. Hill dropped out of high school. There was no single dramatic moment attached to the decision. The school had nothing to offer that the cab stand and the Vario operation had not already surpassed. The cab stand offered something school never had, the feeling of being genuinely useful, of being part of something with real stakes and consequences, where what you did and who you trusted actually determined who you were. He could never be a made man. The Italian-American Mafia accepted only men of full Italian ancestry into its formal membership, and Henry Hill's father was Irish, which closed that door permanently. But the Lucchese family's Vario crew was prepared to have associates of any background who produced revenue and who never, under any circumstances, spoke to anyone in law enforcement about what they had seen or heard. Henry Hill understood that second requirement before anyone stated it explicitly. He had been watching the neighborhood long enough to know what happened to people who got it wrong. His first formal test of it came when he was 16. Hill and Lenny Vario, Paul's son, used a stolen credit card to buy snow tires for Tuddy's wife. When two detectives arrived and placed Hill in a rough interrogation, Hill gave them his name and nothing else. Vario's attorney arranged his release. A suspended sentence followed. What mattered more than the legal outcome was what the incident demonstrated to the men who ran the operation. A young man who kept his mouth shut when he was frightened, who produced nothing useful for investigators despite every incentive to, was worth developing. Paul Vario noted it. Jimmy Burke, who had been watching Hill from a distance for a year, noted it with particular interest. Burke recognized in Hill's silence the quality he valued most, and that quality could not be manufactured in someone who did not already possess it. You either refused to talk or you did not. The men who ran criminal organizations had been distinguishing between those two types of young men for as long as there had been criminal organizations. The neighborhood had given Hill a framework, and the cab stand had given him a function within it. What he needed next was a model, a man whose example showed him not just what to do, but how to be. He had been watching one at a distance since 1955. He was about to meet him at a card game. James Burke was born on July 5th, 1931, in New York City, the child of an Irish mother and an unknown father. His mother placed him in a foster home when he was 2 years old. The institutional system that received him and the household that eventually took him and produced a young man who was, by his early teens, committed to crime with the focused purpose of someone who had already decided that nothing legitimate was going to help him, and that the men worth knowing were men who operated by different rules. He lived for a period during his early teens with a foster family in Rockaway, Queens, and he maintained a relationship with them throughout his life, eventually sending them monthly envelopes of unmarked cash. but the track he had chosen was not one they were going to pull him off. Between the ages of 16 and 22, Burke was behind bars for all but 86 days. The criminal justice system that was supposed to be discouraging him was instead introducing him to the network he needed. His most consequential early arrest came in 1949, when he was 18, for passing approximately $3,000 in counterfeit checks on behalf of a Colombo crime family associate. The sentence was 5 years at Elmira Reformatory. Burke served it without giving up a single name. That silence, in the world he was learning to navigate, was the most valuable thing he had done yet. It earned him lasting gratitude and the specific notice of men in both the Lucchese and Colombo families, who kept careful track of which young men, when it counted, refused to talk. Inside Elmira and the other institutions where he spent his early adult years, Burke built his physical strength and his reputation simultaneously. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and understood to be violent in a way that was useful rather than erratic. He used force when a situation required it, and he did not use it when it did not. He performed murders inside prison at the direction of made men who recognized his reliability. He solidified connections across ethnic lines in a way that the Italian only formal membership structure of the Mafia did not permit on the outside, but that the practical world of incarceration routinely produced. After his release from Elmira, Burke settled into the world of truck hijacking and cargo theft in the area surrounding what was then called Idlewild Airport, the Queens facility that would be renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport in November of 1963. The airport was the most lucrative target in the region for a man with his particular skills. Cargo moved through it constantly in volumes that made individual losses difficult to track and individual thefts profitable enough that entire crews built their livelihoods around the freight operations. Burke built his connections among drivers, dispatchers, and cargo handlers who knew what specific trucks contained and when specific shipments were moving. He paid generously for the information, and when his crew stopped the driver and took a truck at gunpoint, he always pressed a $50 bill into the driver's hand afterward, compensation for the inconvenience of having been robbed. The practice seemed impossible to explain in any conventional understanding of criminal behavior. In the specific culture that operated around the airport, it was the source of his nickname, Jimmy the Gent. Paul Vario recognized early what Burke brought. As a Lucchese caporegime with influence over the airport territory, Vario could not make Burke in any formal sense, but he could bring him into the crew as an associate, give him access to Lucchese resources and protection, and take a percentage of whatever Burke's operations produced. The arrangement suited both of them. Burke brought in money reliably, and Vario provided the organizational umbrella under which he could operate. It was in this context, in this crew operating out of Ozone Park and East New York in the mid-1950s, that Jimmy Burke sat down at a card game and a 13-year-old boy walked across the room with a drink. Henry Hill had been at Paul Vario's cab stand for a year by the time he first encountered Burke. He had spent that year watching everything, running errands, learning the rhythm of how the operation worked, and identifying by observation who the significant figures were. Burke was already significant. Hill had seen him from a distance. At the card game, Burke tipped him $20 for carrying a drink from the bar to the table. Hill later described the moment with a specificity that suggests it lodged in him permanently. He had never seen anyone with that kind of casual money, that kind of easy authority, that kind of complete comfort in the world. Burke recognized something in the boy as well, though whatever he recognized at that point was largely potential. A kid from the right neighborhood, with the right instincts, who would never be made, but might be worth developing anyway. The two men were separated by 15 years, two different generations of the same world, and the connection between them was not accidental. It was the organized crime equivalent of a talent identification, an older operator who recognized in a young associate the specific qualities that his own experience told him were rare and worth cultivating. The education that followed was not formal. Nothing was written down. Everything was demonstrated. The years between 1957 and 1963 were the years in which Henry Hill became, in the only sense that mattered to him, something. He was a teenager and then a young man in an operation that evaluated him constantly, and he was performing consistently well by the metrics that operation used. His first encounter with arson had come when Tuddy Vario took him to eliminate the rebel cab company in the middle of the night. The competing company's owner had come from Alabama and opened just around the corner from Vario's operation. Sometime after midnight, Tuddy and Hill drove there with a drum of gasoline. Hill smashed the cab windows and filled them with gasoline-soaked newspaper, then lit them from matchbooks. The job was done before sunrise. What it demonstrated to the men who mattered was that Hill did what was asked, did it without hesitation, and came back the following day as if nothing had happened. The stolen credit card arrest at 16, and the silence that followed it, has already been noted for what it confirmed to Burke. What it produced more broadly was an acknowledged belonging in the operation. Hill was now someone the organization had assessed under pressure and found reliable. That was a status that no amount of errand running alone could have produced. Burke and Hill could not be made men, a fact that bound them to each other in a particular way. The Italian-only membership rule of the Mafia placed both of them permanently outside the inner sanctum of the organizations they served. But the Lucchese family's attitude toward associates was practical rather than formal. If you earned, if you were loyal, if you did not talk, you belonged to the operation as fully as the rules would allow. Burke had been demonstrating those qualities since his first arrest as a teenager. Hill was learning to do the same. In approximately 1960, when Hill was around 17, he enlisted in the United States Army and was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, as part of the paratroopers. The 3 years he spent there did not sever his connections to the Vario crew. He maintained contact throughout his service, and the habits he had developed at the cab stand did not disappear during his enlistment. He ran schemes inside the military, selling surplus food from the kitchen, making pay advances to fellow soldiers at interest, moving tax-free cigarettes through the post. Before his discharge, he spent 2 months in the stockade for stealing a local sheriff's car and fighting in a bar with a civilian and some Marines. What the Army years produced, beyond the contacts and the minor schemes, was a particular kind of clarity about who Henry Hill was. He had taken the world of the cab stand and the Vario crew to Fort Bragg with him, and it had worked there the same way it worked in Brooklyn. The systems were different, but the essential skills were the same. Read the room, identify the leverage, produce something useful, and never give anyone with authority any reason to look at you too closely. He came back in 1963 understanding that what he knew how to do was not neighborhood specific, it was portable, and it was worth more than he had been paid for it so far. He returned to New York and to a full criminal career. Arson, stolen car operations, hijacking, intimidation. The range of activities was the complete palette of what the Vario crew offered an associate who had proven himself over 8 years and who came back from the Army with contacts, confidence, and the clear understanding that he was not going to be working at the margins much longer. What Hill was by 1963 was trusted, capable, connected, and permanently locked out of the formal membership that would have given him the protection those qualities deserved. Burke, 15 years older and one of the most respected figures in the Vario operation, was the model Hill had been orienting himself toward for 7 years. When Hill returned from the Army, Burke was still the example, not just in terms of which jobs to pull, but in terms of how to carry oneself, how to command the particular deference that the men Hill admired had always commanded. Hill absorbed what Burke modeled with the specific attention of someone who has been trying to learn this particular lesson for a very long time. The crew they were building together had a third central figure who had been present for much of Hill's development, but who now became more operationally significant. Tommy DeSimone was fully Italian, which meant that in theory he could be made one day, and he operated with a violent energy that was useful to the crew and occasionally difficult to contain. He and Hill had grown up in similar circumstances and had known each other for years. What DeSimone brought that Hill and Burke did not was an absolute willingness to do anything, without the calculation or the hesitation that both of the other men applied. The three of them together, Burke as the architect, Hill as the connector and earner, DeSimone as the instrument of last resort, formed the operational triangle that would define the following decade. What that decade would look like was still forming. Two things would give it its shape: a woman Henry Hill was about to meet, and a score the three of them were about to pull at Kennedy Airport. In 1965, Paul Vario arranged a double date for his son and for Henry Hill at a restaurant in Queens. The other woman on the date was Karen Friedman, the daughter of a Jewish family from Lawrence, Long Island. By Karen's own account, the evening was not promising. Hill made a decent first impression and then did not appear for the next engagement he had promised. What followed was a courtship that operated in the spaces that Hill's criminal life opened up. Nightclubs where he knew the owners by name, restaurants where the best table was always available, the particular glamour of a life that looked from the outside like unlimited access and effortless abundance, the kind of life that is very effective at courtship when the person being courted does not yet know its actual source. Karen Friedman did not know when the courtship was happening what Henry Hill actually did for a living. Her family did not approve of the relationship. When Hill and Karen married in 1965, they did so by eloping to North Carolina. His associates from the Vario crew attended. Karen's family was not present. The envelope gifts from the guests that day represented more money than most wedding receptions see across their entire duration, because the men delivering them understood that a contribution to a colleague's wedding was a statement of relationship and an investment in goodwill. Karen would spend the following years learning, in increments, what the life actually involved. The knowledge arrived not through any direct revelation, but through the accumulation of incidents that did not add up to the construction business, the sudden money, the late nights, the wrong people calling the house at the wrong hours. Tommy DeSimone was present throughout those years as a constant in the social and criminal world Hill occupied. Hill and DeSimone had been running together since they were teenagers, and their working relationship had the ease and mutual recklessness of two men who had grown up making the same calculations and trusted each other's judgment because they had survived the same mistakes together. DeSimone was volatile in a way that was sometimes frightening to be near, but the volatility was also part of what made him effective. He did not hesitate. He did not recalibrate. The first major score that Hill and DeSimone executed together was the Air France cargo robbery at John F. Kennedy International Airport on April 7, 1967. They had obtained a duplicate key from a guard who worked in the secured cargo area. Shortly before midnight on April 6th, they drove to the terminal, entered the secured zone unchallenged using the duplicate key, and used a small flashlight to locate and load 7 bags of cash into a suitcase. They walked out with $420,000. No alarm was raised, no shots were fired, nobody was hurt. The theft was not discovered until a Wells Fargo truck arrived Monday morning to collect the money and found the vault empty. Hill later said the Air France operation was what elevated his standing in the organization more than anything he had done before. He was 23 years old and had walked out of a secured cargo terminal at one of the world's busiest airports with $420,000 and no witnesses. The money was divided according to the tribute structure that governed all operations under Lucchese auspices. Portions went to Vario and to the Colombo Capo, who claimed the airport as his territory, and the remainder was split among the participants. Burke had been involved in the planning, and the Air France robbery represented the kind of escalation he had been pushing toward. Larger scores, better intelligence, more reliable inside access. His crew at the airport had been running hijackings and cargo thefts for years, and Hill and DeSimone's success demonstrated what that accumulated institutional knowledge could produce when it was applied to a properly organized operation. Hill used his share to purchase a restaurant on Queens Boulevard that he called The Suite. He had intended it to function as a legitimate business that would provide distance between himself and his criminal work. Within months, members of Lucchese and Gambino crews had moved in as regulars, and the distinction between the restaurant as a business and the restaurant as a mob gathering point became impossible to maintain. Hill had not intended this precisely, but he also did not object because the men who gathered there were the men he needed to know. The murder of Billy Batts would complicate everything they had built, and it was coming. William Benvena, who went by Billy Batts, was a made man in the Gambino crime family, who had been away from New York for 6 years on a federal conviction. He was released in the spring of 1970 and quickly threw himself a welcome home party at Robert's Lounge, the bar that Jimmy Burke owned in Ozone Park, and that served as the operational center of his crew. The party was for his return, which he was celebrating with the particular confidence of a man who had served his time and emerged with his status intact. The specific incident that set the following events in motion was not complicated. Tommy DeSimone had been a shoeshine boy at some point earlier in his life, and Bats made a joke about it in the room, asking whether DeSimone still shined shoes. The joke was the kind that only works if the target has no power to object, and in a room full of people whose standing was partly defined by how they were treated by others, the implication cut in a way that DeSimone did not absorb and move past. Later that night, Burke, DeSimone, and Hill beat William Benvena to near death in the bar. They put him in the trunk of a car while he was still alive. During the drive, they realized he was still breathing. They stopped and killed him. He was buried outside the city. The murder was an unauthorized killing of a Gambino-made man, which placed all three of them in the most serious kind of organizational trouble the structure could generate. You did not kill a made man without permission from the relevant families. The incident would have consequences that unfolded over the following decade, but its most immediate effect on the Vario crew was the need to manage the aftermath quietly. Bats had disappeared. His body had disappeared. The story that would explain his absence in the organizational world, where such explanations are demanded, had to hold. In 1972, Hill and Burke traveled to Tampa, Florida, to recover money owed to a union official connected to the Vario crew by a gambler named Gaspar Chiacho. The debt collection turned into an assault, and the assault turned into a federal arrest. The charge was extortion. Burke received a 10-year sentence, though. Hill received the same. Burke was paroled after 6 years. Hill came out after 4. Federal prison at Lewisburg brought Hill into contact with men who were trafficking drugs, and he paid attention. A man from Pittsburgh walked him through the mechanics of the business, and Hill stored every detail. Paul Vario was also serving time at Lewisburg during part of Hill's sentence on a separate conviction, and the two of them occupied the same institution with the specific closeness that proximity and shared circumstances produced behind bars. What was happening to Karen Hill during those years was something Hill either did not know about fully until later, or chose not to examine too closely. Paul Vario had an affair with Karen while Hill was incarcerated. Tommy DeSimone, in a separate incident, assaulted her and struck her when she resisted. The theory that has circulated most persistently since is that Vario, learning of what DeSimone had done, subsequently passed information to Gambino family contacts about DeSimone's role in the unauthorized killing of Billy Bats. If that theory is accurate, Vario set in motion what would eventually become DeSimone's death, using the Gambinos as his instrument. Whether or not the theory is accurate, the consequence was the same. Henry Hill was paroled on July 12, 1978. Burke, released earlier, delivered a specific and direct warning: do not traffic drugs. The Lucchese family had prohibited narcotics dealing among its members and associates for a strategic reason that was not complicated. Federal drug convictions carried mandatory sentences severe enough to make cooperation with the government a more appealing calculation than loyalty. The family had watched this dynamic destroy other operations and had no intention of manufacturing the conditions for it in their own crew. Vario had stated it. Burke repeated it. Hill heard it. He resumed his drug operation the day after his parole, beginning with a trip to Pittsburgh to expand the connections he had built while incarcerated. The warning Vario had given them was going to prove, in every particular, exactly accurate. The opportunity that produced the Lufthansa heist arrived through a chain of obligation that stretched from a cargo supervisor's gambling habit to a bookmaker's network, to Henry Hill, to Jimmy Burke, and finally, to a vault full of money at Kennedy Airport. None of the men who would plan and execute the robbery went looking for this specific score. It came to them through debt. Louis Werner was a cargo supervisor at Lufthansa's terminal at Kennedy Airport. He was also a gambler, and not a successful one. By the mid 1970s, Werner had accumulated a substantial gambling debt to Martin Krugman, a bookmaker who operated a wig shop in Queens as his legitimate cover and who maintained connections to the criminal network that Hill and Burke operated within. Werner, pressed to find a way to resolve the debt, offered Krugman something more valuable than money: inside information. Werner knew from his position at the cargo terminal that Lufthansa flew large quantities of American currency from Germany on a regular basis. American servicemen and tourists who had exchanged dollars for German marks sent their money back through the airline's cargo operations, and the cash, once it arrived at Kennedy, was stored in a vault at Building 261 until an armored truck came to collect it the following business day. The amounts that moved through this arrangement were substantial. Werner had watched them move, and Werner, facing a debt he could not otherwise service, shared what he had seen. He and a coworker named Peter Gruenwald had already demonstrated that the opportunity was real. 2 years earlier, they had taken $22,000 in foreign currency from Lufthansa using their access. The money available in a properly organized operation would be many times that amount. Krugman brought Werner's information to Hill. Hill brought it to Burke. Burke, who had built his entire criminal career on the exploitation of inside information at the airport, understood immediately what he was looking at. Paul Vario gave his approval. The Bonanno crime family, which considered Kennedy Airport its exclusive territory, had to receive a cut of any take generated there by outside crews. Burke negotiated the arrangement with Bonanno capo Vinny Asaro. The Bonannos would receive their portion, the Lucchese organization would take its share, and Burke's crew would keep the remainder. Burke assembled a team. Tommy DeSimone was in, Angelo Seppe was in, Louis Cafora was assigned a role in the robbery and in the subsequent laundering of proceeds. Joe Manri and Robert McMahon, both of whom worked cargo operations at the airport for Air France and were familiar with the terminal's layout, were added to the crew. Paolo Licastri, who would represent the Gambino family's financial interests in the operation, brought an additional organizational layer. Frank Burke, Jimmy's son, would drive one of the backup vehicles. Parnell Edwards, who went by Stax, was assigned the simplest job on the operation: drive the van to a junkyard in New Jersey after the robbery and have it destroyed. Werner was promised 10% of whatever the take produced. Individual participants were told to expect between $10,000 and $50,000 each, based on an estimated haul of approximately $2 million. The planning sessions at Robert's Lounge were thorough, in a way that reflected everything Burke had learned from 2 decades of operating around the airport. He insisted on knowing the exact schedule of the lunchroom breaks on the overnight shift, the precise layout of the vault room and the doors surrounding it, the number and positioning of employees during the hours between 3 and 5 in the morning. Werner walked Burke through the terminal's procedures repeatedly, covering the timing of the security checks, the sequence of access through the double-locked doors, and the exact location within the building where the cash was staged before it was moved to the vault. Burke committed the layout to memory the way a man commits a route he has driven enough times that he no longer needs to think about where the turns are. Every contingency was thought through. Every sequence was rehearsed. Burke was not a man who improvised on the night of a major operation, and he was not going to start now. Then, on Saturday, December 9th, 1978, Werner passed word that a large shipment had arrived at the airport and would remain in the vault through the entire weekend. The regular armored truck would not come until Monday morning. Whatever was in that vault was sitting there for 2 full days. Burke moved the date forward. The night of December 11th was the window. At 3:12 in the morning on Monday, December 11th, 1978, a black Ford Econoline van, carrying 6 men in ski masks, pulled up to the gate of the Lufthansa cargo facility at Kennedy Airport. They were wearing gloves. One of them removed the lock on the gate with bolt cutters. They drove through and got out. The 6 men entered through the building's exterior door using a key Werner had provided. The employees on their overnight break in the 3rd-floor lunchroom were taken at gunpoint and ordered to the floor. Joe Manri, who knew the building from his Air France work, was responsible for locating and accounting for all 9 employees on duty at that hour. Each one was found. Each was held in the lunchroom while the crew worked through the building below. The vault required access through a set of double locked doors. The crew had planned for this. The access was obtained. The work of loading money was systematic. They located the cash packages and the jewelry, moved them out, and worked with the concentrated efficiency of men who had been over the plan enough times to execute it without consulting each other. At 4:16 in the morning, they drove out. 64 minutes from entry to exit. No shots had been fired. None of the 9 Lufthansa employees held hostage had been seriously injured. The crew drove to Robert's lounge. When they counted what they had taken, it was not the $2 million the plan had been built around. It was $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry, a total of $5,875,000. It was the largest cash robbery in American history. The first serious problem emerged within 48 hours. Parnell Stacks Edwards, assigned to drive the van to the New Jersey junkyard and have it destroyed, did not do it. He drove it to his girlfriend's apartment in Brooklyn instead, parked it near a fire hydrant in violation of the parking regulations, went inside, and went to sleep. He had been drinking and using drugs, and the task he had been given slipped. 2 days after the robbery, police found the van. It matched the description that had already circulated from the Lufthansa crime scene. Inside, investigators found ski masks, a jacket, fingerprint evidence that pointed to members of Burke's crew, and a mold they made of a sneaker footprint on the floor. A second detail complicated the situation further. One of the Lufthansa employees, questioned after the robbery, recalled noticing that one of the masked men had been wearing highly polished shoes. Investigators recognized that detail immediately as characteristic of Tommy DeSimone, a figure known to law enforcement as a sharp dresser who maintained the habit of polished shoes regardless of circumstances. DeSimone's participation, inferred from a footwear choice, pointed directly to the crew that operated out of Robert's lounge. Within days, the FBI had established heavy surveillance on Burke's organization. Listening devices were placed in vehicles and on phones at the bar. Agents monitored payphones in the immediate vicinity and captured fragments of conversation that were suggestive but not yet definitive. The evidence trail had connected the robbery to Burke's crew without yet producing the proof that would allow an immediate arrest. Burke understood precisely what the van had cost. The most profitable robbery in American history had been followed within 48 hours by the creation of a direct physical evidence trail leading to his operation. The investigators could not yet prove everything they strongly suspected, but the problem was not going to resolve itself, and Burke was not a man who waited for problems to resolve themselves. He had a simpler method than paying everyone out. He had been using it since he was young enough to understand that dead men did not collect their shares. The first man to die was Parnell Stacks Edwards. The van had been his responsibility and he had failed it catastrophically, but his death was not only about the van. Burke had resolved to eliminate everyone connected to the robbery who represented a potential pressure point. Anyone who could be arrested, anyone whose financial desperation or personal instability might eventually make cooperation with federal investigators more appealing than silence. The list of people who met those criteria began with the man who had left the van by a fire hydrant. Edwards was shot in his Queens apartment approximately 1 week after the robbery. According to Henry Hill's later accounts, the killers were Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Seppi. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who had brought Werner's information to Hill and served as the initial link in the chain that produced the heist, disappeared on January 6, 1979. Krugman had been loudly pressing for the money owed to him, behavior that Burke read as unpredictability and a pathway to law enforcement. His body was never found. It is believed he was killed and his remains dismembered. Richard Eaton and Tom Monteleone were Florida businessmen who had been involved in laundering the Lufthansa proceeds and who were believed by Burke to have skimmed from the money they were managing. Both were murdered in the early months of 1979. Louis Cafora had been one of the stick-up men on the robbery itself. In the days after the heist, Burke had issued a specific instruction to everyone involved: no conspicuous spending, nothing that could not be explained by your established income. Kafora ignored it. He purchased a custom pink Cadillac for his wife Joanna and drove it near the airport while the FBI was actively investigating the crime. He also discussed the robbery and other mob business with Joanna directly, in violation of every understanding about what was and was not shared with family members. When Louis and Joanna Kafora both disappeared in March of 1979, their bodies were never found. The theory that has persisted is that they were compacted along with their vehicle at an auto wrecking yard. Robert McMahon and Joe Manrie had worked cargo operations at Kennedy for Air France and had been recruited because their knowledge of the terminal was operationally useful. Both declined an FBI offer of witness protection in the months following the robbery. In May of 1979, their bodies were found in the front seat of a Buick, parked in Brooklyn. They had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. Paolo Licastri, who had represented the Gambino family's financial interest in the heist, was found in June of 1979. His body had been shot, burned, and left naked on a trash heap in Brooklyn. The trail of bodies from December of 1978 through June of 1979 represented a systematic elimination of the network the heist had required. Burke was compressing the population of people who knew what had happened and who might one day be induced to discuss it. Tommy DeSimone was murdered on January 14, 1979, but for reasons that had nothing to do with Lufthansa. The Billy Batts killing from nearly 9 years earlier had never been resolved within the Gambino family, and the family had determined that DeSimone was responsible. The theory that has circulated most consistently since is that Vario, in the aftermath of what DeSimone had done to Karen Hill during Henry's incarceration, passed information to Gambino contacts confirming DeSimone's role in the unauthorized killing. The Gambino family arranged the response. DeSimone was brought in with the promise that he was about to be formally initiated as a made man in the Lucchese family. He was killed before he understood what was happening. Henry Hill later said that the news of DeSimone's death was the only occasion on which he ever saw Jimmy Burke weep. Burke had used DeSimone as an instrument in multiple operations, had relied on his capacity for violence, and had genuine affection for him in the complicated way that men in that world have affection for the people they use. The loss was real, even though the mechanisms that produced it were ones Burke had not arranged. Hill was watching all of this and drawing the only conclusions the evidence would support. He watched Stax Edwards disappear. He watched Krugman disappear. He watched DeSimone die for separate reasons, but at the same moment that the rest of the heist participants were being eliminated. He understood the shape of what Burke was doing. He understood the direction the circle was moving. He was also aware that his own position in the pattern was not secure. Henry Hill's drug operation after his parole had expanded quickly. He was trafficking marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and quaaludes through a network built from the contacts he had made at Lewisburg, running product to Pittsburgh and managing a supply chain that generated exceptional income. The income was exceptional enough that Hill's own use of the product grew alongside the business, and by the late 1970s, he was both a supplier and an addict, the second condition beginning to compromise the discipline that the first required. Paul Vario's prohibition on narcotics trafficking was not ambiguous, and its strategic logic was not complicated. Federal drug convictions carried mandatory sentences severe enough to make cooperation with the government a rational option for men facing them. The Lucchese family had watched this dynamic destroy other operations and had expressed its understanding as policy: no drugs because the sentence for drugs produces informants. Vario had stated it clearly. Burke had repeated it to Hill on the day of his release. Hill had heard it and proceeded to rebuild his drug network the following morning. Burke eventually became involved in the drug operation as well, because the money was too significant to leave entirely to Hill's management. Both of them were now operating outside the boundaries the family had established. Both of them understood in the abstract what that meant for them if they were caught. The specific consequence arrived through a young person who had been one of Hill's distribution contacts and who walked into the offices of two narcotics detectives, Daniel Mann and William Broder, and told them what Henry Hill was doing. The federal surveillance that followed built a case Hill could not see and could not counter because he did not know its contours. What he could see was the behavior of the people around him. Angelo Sepe and Anthony Stabile were being contacted by Burke about Hill's situation, and the conversations Hill began picking up through the overlapping information networks of the criminal world were not conversations about how to protect him. Sepe and Stabile believed Hill was a liability. They were telling Burke he was no good, that he was a junkie, that the problem he represented needed a permanent resolution. Burke told them not to worry about it. For the moment, that response contained the pressure. Hill heard about it, but did not yet fully understand what the containment meant, or whether it was a temporary delay or a genuine decision by Burke to protect the man he had been developing since the man was 13 years old. The Florida trip clarified it. Burke proposed that Hill travel to Florida with Anthony Stabile to handle a piece of business involving a man named Bobby Germain's son. Burke provided the address. He told Hill when to go. Hill knew Stabile. Hill knew what trips to quiet locations with men who had been pushing for his death tended to produce. He was being sent somewhere he would not come back from. The business in Florida was not business. It was an exit. Hill did not go. He maneuvered through a subsequent meeting with Burke at a location Hill did not recognize, a shop Burke operated, where Burke pressed again for the Florida trip to happen. Hill managed the conversation without committing and without confronting. He had been maneuvering in difficult conversations for 25 years, but managing a conversation was not the same as resolving the situation, and the situation, by the spring of 1980, had only one logical resolution from either direction. In April of 1980, federal narcotics detectives arrested Henry Hill on trafficking charges. Edward McDonald, the head of the Brooklyn Organized Crime Strike Force, moved to hold Hill additionally as a material witness in the Lufthansa robbery. The two cases together placed Hill in exactly the position the Lucchese family's drug prohibition had been designed to prevent. A man with everything Hill knew, facing decades in a federal institution, for whom the mathematics of cooperation looked very different from the mathematics of loyalty. When federal investigators sat down with Henry Hill, they played him a recording. It was a surveillance tape from the monitoring operation that had been watching Burke and the rest of the crew since the Lufthansa investigation began. On the tape, Jimmy Burke was speaking with Paul Vario. Burke was telling Vario that Henry Hill needed to be whacked. The tape was not a rumor passed through several intermediaries. It was not something Sapie had said to someone who had told someone else. It was Jimmy Burke's voice, saying what Jimmy Burke believed needed to happen, captured by the federal government, and played to the man whose death was being discussed. The $20 bill at the card game had been 24 years ago. Henry Hill had a decision to make. The decision that Henry Hill was weighing in the spring of 1980 was not a question of loyalty and betrayal as a matter of principle. It was a calculation, and the terms of the calculation had already been laid out in the months and years leading up to that spring in ways that left very little room for competing interpretations. The men who had been in the planning sessions at Robert's Lounge, the men who had sat across from him and talked through the logistics of what became the largest cash robbery in American history, were mostly dead. The man who had taught him everything was on a recording saying he needed to die. The family whose prohibition he had violated would, under its own logic, view his arrest as confirmation that he was going to cooperate regardless, because that was what happened to men in his position. The logic the family used to justify the drug prohibition was self-fulfilling. If you get caught dealing drugs, you will be facing enough prison time to make cooperation rational. Hill was caught dealing drugs. He was now facing enough prison time to make cooperation rational. The family's prediction about itself had come true. What Hill had to offer the government was substantial. He had been part of or present for nearly every significant criminal operation that Burke's crew had run over the previous 2.5 decades. He had helped plan the Lufthansa heist. He knew about the Air France robbery. He had been present for the Billy Batts murder. He knew who had been killed in the months after December 11th, 1978, and why and by whose direction. He knew about the Boston College basketball point-shaving scheme that Burke had been running during the 1978 and 79 season, an operation in which college players had been paid to control the point spread on games for the benefit of gamblers connected to Burke's organization. He knew about the drug operation that both he and Burke had been running in defiance of the family's prohibition. He knew the names, the dates, the specific details that convert federal suspicions into prosecutable cases. None of that knowledge had any value if he remained silent. All of it had enormous value if he chose to speak. On May 27, 1980, Henry Hill signed a cooperation agreement with the United States Department of Justice Organized Crime Strike Force. He became a federal witness. Hill, his wife Karen, and their two children, Greg and Gina, entered the United States Marshals Witness Protection Program. He was given a new name, Martin Todd Lewis. The family was relocated from New York through a series of cities that had nothing in common with the neighborhood where Hill had spent his entire life. Cincinnati, Omaha, Butte, Montana, and others. The specific geography of what had made Henry Hill who he was, the cab stand, the card games, Robert's Lounge, the terminal at Kennedy Airport, the restaurants and nightclubs where he had been welcomed by name for a quarter of a century, was replaced by anonymity in mid-sized American cities where nobody had any reason to know him. The knowledge Hill had spent 25 years accumulating began producing legal results almost immediately. His testimony was not simply evidence in a single case. It was a window into the operations of an organized crime crew across decades, and the federal prosecutors who worked with him understood that what he possessed was enough to dismantle a significant portion of what the Lucchese family had built in Queens, Brooklyn, and at the airport. The testimony Hill provided eventually produced 50 convictions. Paul Vario was convicted in 1984 of racketeering and extortion charges. The sentence was 4 years. The capo, who had been the first significant figure in Henry Hill's life, the man who had noticed an 11-year-old crossing the street in 1955 and had decided that boy was worth cultivating, received 4 years for providing the no-show union card that had given the boy his first cover. Jimmy Burke was convicted in 1982 of conspiracy charges connected to the Boston College point-shaving scheme. The sentence was 20 years. While serving that sentence, Burke was tried and convicted of the murder of Richard Eaton, the Florida businessman murdered in January of 1979. That conviction carried a sentence of 20 years to life. Burke was never charged for organizing the Lufthansa heist. The murder campaign he had run in the months after December 11th, 1978, had achieved, in that specific legal sense, exactly what it was designed to achieve: the systematic elimination of the witnesses whose testimony might have connected him to the robbery. Louis Werner, the inside man, was the only person ever convicted in connection with the robbery itself. The $5,875,000 taken from Building 261 was never recovered. Jimmy Burke continued to be Jimmy Burke after his convictions, which is to say that the qualities that had defined him for 5 decades did not disappear in the federal institutions where he spent the rest of his life. He was housed at Wende Correctional Facility in Alden, New York, when he was diagnosed with cancer. He was transferred to the Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo for treatment. On April 13th, 1996, James Burke died. He was 64 years old. Had he lived, he would have been eligible for parole on November 3, 2008. He was buried at St. Charles Cemetery in East Farmingdale, New York. His son Frank had been dead for 9 years by then. Frank James Burke, who had driven a backup vehicle on the night of December 11, 1978, was shot and killed on May 18, 1987, outside the Suncrest Tavern on Liberty Avenue in East New York, Brooklyn, during an argument that ended in gunfire. He was 26 years old. The criminal world that his father had inhabited for decades had produced a second generation, and the second generation had not inherited the discipline that had allowed the first to survive as long as it had. Paul Vario died in prison in 1988 of lung cancer while serving his sentence. Angelo Sepe, who had been among the crew members pushing for Hill's death in the months before Hill's arrest, was himself killed in the mid-1980s by his own Lucchese family contacts for stealing cash and cocaine from a Lucchese-connected drug dealer. The discipline that Burke had tried to maintain in his crew, the rule against stealing from the organization, had not survived the dissolution of the structure that had enforced it. Henry Hill in the Witness Protection Program was not a man who found anonymity easy to maintain. The program moved his family through multiple cities, but Hill's habits, his drug use, his drinking, his disposition toward exactly the behavior that drew attention, were not habits the program could extinguish. In 1987, he was arrested in Seattle on cocaine trafficking charges. The federal government expelled him from the protection program. He and Karen separated in 1989, and their divorce was finalized in 2002. What Hill did after expulsion was not hiding. In 1985, Nicholas Pileggi, a crime reporter, published Wise Guy, Life in a Mafia Family, a reconstruction of Hill's criminal career based on extensive interviews. The book was a bestseller. In 1990, Martin Scorsese adapted it into Goodfellas, a film that became one of the most celebrated works in American cinema. Ray Liotta played Hill. Robert De Niro played Burke under the altered name Jimmy Conway. Joe Pesci played DeSimone under the name Tommy DeVito. Pesci won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. The film made Henry Hill famous in the most visible possible way at the moment he was theoretically in hiding. He embraced the visibility rather than retreating from it. He appeared on talk shows and gave interviews. He published a cookbook in 2002. He opened a restaurant in West Haven, Connecticut in 2007, which closed the following month after a fire. He became a regular guest on Howard Stern's radio program, where he discussed his past with a candor and occasional dark humor that suggested a man who had made his peace with what he had done, or was performing that peace for an audience that found it entertaining. The men who might have wanted to kill him were mostly dead or imprisoned. The incentive to locate a former associate who was publicly making himself available for radio appearances and signing autographed memorabilia had diminished considerably. Henry Hill died on June 12, 2012, one day after his 69th birthday, of complications from long-standing heart disease related to chronic smoking. He had been living in the Topanga Canyon area of Los Angeles with his companion Lisa Caserta. She said that he went out peacefully for a good fella. He was cremated the following day. The 50 convictions his testimony produced stand as the specific documented measure of what Henry Hill knew and what that knowledge was ultimately worth. Two men, shaped by the same neighborhood and the same criminal organization, died 16 years apart of illness in institutional settings, neither killed by the justice system they had spent decades evading, and neither killed by the criminal world they had served. That is not the ending either of them would have predicted at Robert's Lounge in the planning sessions before December 11th, 1978. It is the ending the record shows. What the relationship between Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill demonstrates is not a simple account of loyalty and its limits, because the loyalty was never unconditional on either side, and both of them knew it at some level throughout their time together. It is a story about what mentorship means when the thing being taught is how to operate outside the law, and what happens when the student accumulates enough knowledge that the teacher begins to see the student as a liability rather than an asset. Burke had been developing Hill since Hill was 13 years old. He had vouched for him, protected him, included him in operations that Hill had no right to access without Burke's sponsorship, and at some point after the Lufthansa robbery, possibly before it, the calculation changed. Hill became something to manage rather than someone to work alongside. The tape that federal investigators played for Hill in the spring of 1980 was not a surprise in any fundamental sense. He had been watching his associates disappear for more than a year. He had understood the shape of what Burke was doing. What the tape gave him was not new information, but confirmation, a document that closed the space between what he suspected and what he knew. It also gave him, in the most practical sense, a particular kind of permission. He could tell himself that he was not the one who had ended the relationship. The relationship had been ended by the man who had started it, in a conversation recorded without either of them knowing it. The Lufthansa money was never found. The case was never officially closed. In 2014, Bonanno family figure Vincent Asaro was indicted in connection with the heist. He was acquitted the following year. The investigation that began when a Ford Econoline van was found near a fire hydrant in December of 1978, was still generating courtroom proceedings more than 35 years later. Jimmy Burke organized the whole thing and was never charged with a single count of it. Henry Hill helped plan it, testified about it before the federal government, and died in a canyon outside Los Angeles on a summer morning in 2012, one day past his 69th birthday. The $20 bill was a long time ago.